Chuck, you're a former Navy SEAL Team 6 squadron leader. And as you're well enough and aware, Ukraine has continued to struggle with red lines that Washington imposes on it because Washington fears that Ukraine could provoke Russia. What do you make about that? What do you think about the red lines that could be crossed in this war?
Is it not a red line when a Russian cruise missile slams into a pediatric hospital? That was no accident. They've attacked 1,500 Ukrainian clinics and hospitals. They hit a cancer hospital in Kherson. Where's the red line? When do you say, hey, that's not collateral damage, that's targeting? Besides, look, I study this carefully, as you know, daily at the micro level. I see what the Russians are targeting. High density civilian targets, hospitals as a priority target. And with this last missile attack, how can you not make the case that Ukraine desperately needs air defense systems? Desperately to protect civilians.
We can expect this winter is going to be very tough for Ukraine. Now that Russia has received attacks by Ukraine today, specifically on energy producing sector, that might lead to Russians feeling the same sort of pain that the Ukrainians feel, which is a great thing. But going forward, I think that we can expect that things are going to be much more complicated in Ukraine in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, another priority target that the Russians have as we wind up the summer and autumn, it will be brief in Ukraine. Russia is specifically targeting thermal generation plants, so the central heating plants. It isn't just invading their less powerful neighbors. They have a legacy of doing that, but also attacking the weak, the children, old people. They find that vulnerability. The brutality, of course, look, well, all wars are brutal, but the brutality built in to the Russian military mindset, it's obscene. It's obscene. And again, I point the finger at Washington.
Washington can fix this all tomorrow if it wished to. It chooses not to. It's that simple. And looking back at what's occurred here is that it is a tragedy that we all understand what is occurring. I mean, Russia's intentionally killing civilians, intentionally targeting them, and Washington is worried about, well, we might cross a red line. Listen, first and foremost, Russia has no capacity to respond to any red line crossing. It has no capacity to do so. Second to that is the fact that Russia is at war with its neighbor. It invaded its neighbor. Its neighbor is defending itself. Can you imagine being in a street fight tomorrow, some sort of a hoodlum were to come up to you and say, give me your wallet, give me this, and start beating you. And a cop were to come along and say, listen, you can push him away, but make sure not to punch the guy. That's against the rules. So you can't punch him. You know, he can pistol whip you. That's okay. But make sure you don't use a closed fist. If you use a closed fist, they'll have to take you to jail as well. How absurd is that argument? Totally absurd. Totally baseless. And that's what Washington, D.C. is doing today to Ukraine.
It is exactly that. You recently interviewed General Ben Hodges, a guy who I look up to quite a bit. The absolute antithesis of a Russian general, right? So his analog in the Russian army is a thug, a grifter, a parasite onto the national defense capability, a crony who has risen up through the ranks, utterly incompetent. And we'll talk later about tactics. Why do I say that? Then you have someone like General Hodges, a scholar, an author, a man who has devoted his life to the profession of arms and served in the highest levels of national command authority. General Hodges says the United States needs to decide who's going to win this war. And that chills me to the bone. It's not just me saying this, right? It's General Hodges. It's embarrassing. I'm on the air a couple times a week. I field these questions constantly. It's embarrassing. And I hear them from all over the world, Jason, like you. I mean, I talk to people all over the world weekly, and it's embarrassing. And our allies see it. I talk to people from Sweden, Norway, Britain, Australia. They tell me what they see the United States doing, and it isn't. Are we back to those times in the 70s and 80s when almost the whole world turned on the United States? Are we going to go back to that? But this time we'll earn their approbation, right? This time we're earning it. It, uh, uh, yeah, it. I'm ashamed. What else can I say? I'm ashamed.
No, there's reason to be ashamed. And the fact is that it is not a problem that's insurmountable. It's not a problem that's complicated for us. It's not a problem that's expensive for us, even. And keep in mind, we're spending less than 5% of the Pentagon's budget to finance this. We are destroying the military of our greatest nemesis for the past 100 years. And
Absolutely.
today is an opportunity to completely destroy the military, to make sure they don't have any more tanks, to make sure that they are no longer able to compete with us internationally. And we have chosen not to do that. Rather, we've chosen to do just enough so the Ukrainians aren't wiped off the face of the map. But the fact is, Ukraine is losing so many people a day, totally unnecessarily, because Washington does not wish to make a firm decision.
Well, the other thing is that the Ukrainian armed forces are operating under conditions that the U.S. military could not operate under. What do I mean? If you are a ground maneuver element of the United States military, whether that is a destroyer at sea or a rifle squad on a street in Iraq, you have 100% air superiority above you. Okay. You also have air defense superiority. So not only do you have fighter planes zooming around up there to shoot any airplane that's coming at you, you also have a dome clamped over you where you have short and intermediate range air defense systems that can move with you. You have artillery dominance. You have superiority in numbers at the point of attack. You have electronic warfare dominance. Otherwise, you can't do your job. You couldn't be expected to maneuver, shoot, move, communicate, or certainly not win against an adversary. We've made sure that Ukraine doesn't have superiority in any of those. Ukraine does not have air sovereignty over its nation. Why? Don't ask me. Their maneuver elements in contact with Russian forces, they don't have air defense dominance. They don't have artillery superiority. They don't have numerical superiority at the point of contact. I mean, I think you see where I'm going. We're not setting them up for victory. The only thing they're not running short on, unfortunately, is the valor of their combatants.
The fact of the matter is, the country is being bled to death. And there's only one solution to that, which is to make it stop. And the fact that Ukraine cannot shoot down a Russian airplane bound towards as close as they can get to Ukrainians' boundary, but for firing off rockets, which will eventually go into a hotel or go into a hospital, is sick. It's perverse. In fact, I'd argue it's perverse. That there is people in Washington, D.C. who are making a decision today that we could do more to help Ukraine. We could allow Ukraine not even to attack Russia, to defend itself. But that's too much. We can't go that far. Because, it might cross a red line. What's this hypothetical nonsense? Total nonsense. Only people in DC think tanks worry about these sorts of fictional red lines that don't exist. Obviously, Russia doesn't care. Russia's obviously targeted hospitals. It's obviously targeted medics. Red Cross. It does not care. And so the fact that we are bent out of shape about it shows that we are not only totally misinformed as to what the priorities are, but that we are not doing what we need to do and can do to help Ukraine.
There are about 40,000 people that work in the Pentagon. Everybody in that building, from the Secretary of Defense to Staff Sergeant Schmuckatelli, who makes coffee, everybody knows what Ukraine needs to win this war. They all know. They have the list drawn up. They know from their own experience what it would take for them to operate in this environment. The decisions are political. They aren't military. And of course, in the United States, military executes policy as it should, made by National Command Authority, elected officials. I just, I don't get it. And especially that when you consider looking ahead as the Georgetown educated national security apparatus should do, Ukraine is never going to be safe until Russia no longer has the means or the desire to invade its neighbors, one, and two, Ukraine has no future with Russia hanging on to Crimea as their unsinkable aircraft carrier, from which they can interdict Ukrainian commerce at any time. Look, a corporal could tell you that. A West Point cadet could tell you that. Why it doesn't percolate into the West Wing, I don't know.
You can hear the frustration when you hear the press conferences of the Pentagon, where they so clearly understand that it's nonsense what's being said. John Kirby, when he's speaking on behalf of the National Security Council, he himself being an admiral, understands very well the absurdity that we draw a fictional line that, a couple hundred miles or 300 kilometers into Russia is where we're allowed to use the weapons in the United States. Further than that's prohibited. Why can't Ukraine shoot down the Russian airplanes that are firing rockets at Ukraine? Or why can't they target them on the pavement when they're located at the airbase? And he gives an answer, and it's very obvious he's uncomfortable because he knows it's complete nonsense. He knows it's a lie. The fact is, there's no reason to prevent it whatsoever. There's not one person in the military who thinks this is a great strategy. These are these totally educated guys who are smart, undoubtedly, but they've read books about what hypothetically Russia might do, or what Russia has said. I don't know a single military guy who says we should toe that line. Every single military guy I've met so far has said, what nonsense, ditch it now, attack Russia, go full out, and put them in their place. Otherwise, we are actually just going to encourage further terrorism.
You have interviewed dozens of high-ranking officials in NATO and formerly of NATO, and the response is absolutely uniform. And you've talked to more people at that level than I have. But I can say I'm a guy with a Western military education. That's it. And look what it forces Ukraine to do. You cannot address the cruise missile threat where it originates, but we'll get into some drone developments that Ukraine has. So they are not without means. But you should be able to target the weapon storage facilities. You should be able to target those cruise missiles when they are on the runway being loaded into strategic bombers. But with these ridiculous rules placed on Ukraine, now Ukraine is forced to do this. And this is literally the dilemma. Here come 100 cruise missiles and 100 Shahed drones, and you have only X number of air defense missiles. What do you protect? Given Russia's targeting priorities, high-density civilian housing, energy infrastructure, and hospitals, what do you intercept? That is what just kills me. Let's go down to the zero line. You're a local battalion commander. Your guys report, hey, here comes 15 Russian soldiers and 3 vehicles. You have to say to them, call me back when there's 20 vehicles, because you don't have the artillery shells. Jason, I can see you shaking your head. Look, I've been in that particular situation. Wow. Call me back when there's 20. And unfortunately, right now, as we speak, that situation is unfolding somewhere on the zero line.
Undoubtedly it is. And it's shocking that, once again, it's not a matter of the fact that it's not possible. It's that there's a lack of political will. It's so simple. There's a lack of political will. If we wish to arm Ukraine to the teeth, we could. Less than 5% of the Pentagon's budget goes in some way to support Ukraine. By the way, a huge amount of that is actually to finance the Pentagon itself, to do its own projects, which are tangentially related to Ukraine. But the fact is, we are spending so little in destroying the Russian military. But we're not willing to spend just a little bit more to make sure that Ukraine wins. We are letting Ukraine bleed. And that is a conscious decision and is a political decision by this administration. So what's your guess? What happens going forward?
Well, there is a point, and I'm afraid the war is going on for a couple of more years, largely because Washington is dictating uh, the amount of equipment that Ukraine gets. I, I think this is happening, though. Russia is no longer in a position to win this war. The manner in which they're fighting, their tactics, the incompetency of their commanders, there is no plan, in my estimation, for Russia to win this war. There is no four-pronged winter offensive that's going to sweep Ukrainian forces into Poland and march into Kyiv. Not only do they not have a plan, they couldn't execute on the plan. If the Pentagon handed a plan, they couldn't do it. So they're going to keep bleeding, the Russians are, but disgustingly, so is Ukraine. And that's breaking my heart. I don't know what we need. We're going to get a new commander in chief, no matter who it is. But more important to me, the United States needs to reassess its national security apparatus. It's got to reassess its its assessment of the security of Europe, because with a resurgent or a victorious Russia, it's Europe that is going to suffer for that, not just Ukraine, our gallant ally. So let's get our thumb out and get with the program.
Russia started this war, and Ukraine has every right to defend itself as it sees fit, which is true, by the way, under international law. It is a country facing aggression and has all the right to defend itself. There is nothing wrong with Ukraine being in Kursk. There's absolutely nothing wrong with attacking the oil infrastructure of Russia, which is the base of their economy. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with Moscow being attacked, which it should be regularly, because there's nothing else that will convince the average Russian that perhaps they've picked the wrong fight than when they realize that they are not impermeable, that they are not an oasis of peace and freedom, per se, as Ukraine is being bombed. They have to understand there's consequences for their actions. And when they realize there's consequences, and very tough consequences, then at some point they might reconsider the bargain they've made. But until then, when we look at what's going on with the Russian military, do you see any signs that things are getting worse for them?
I definitely the latest installment of the mutiny videos that I saw this week. Group of Russian soldiers getting together with a cell phone to lodge some complaints, and perforce that is a mutinous assembly as far as anyone is concerned in any military. But these Russian soldiers had the following legitimate complaints. They were being actively extorted by their officers. Their officers had begun the process of taking the cash cards off their fallen comrades and pumping out their bank accounts. That soldiers were routinely chained to trees and beaten with bats. So here's something I suggest, and I mean this. If your army is run like this, all you need to do is look through military history and see those armies fall apart. You go back to the Trojan Wars, go back to the Peloponnesian Wars, go back to the Punic Wars. If your army and your soldiers realize they're being treated like that, and we are already at that point for every Russian serviceman in Ukraine, he has most of those same gripes. Your combat effectiveness, at the very least, is halved. And that's a fancy term for you're going to start mailing it in, right? You're not going to fix bayonets for the glory of the motherland. You're just going to try to do the absolute minimum. And we're already at that point. But what that also does is it makes the Russian forces brittle. So they get a good hard punch and they fall apart. Is that wishful thinking? If the Russian forces weren't brittle, the Kursk offensive could not have achieved what it did. When you give Ukraine the tools and allow it to create the preconditions for success, air defense dominance, as it has in Kursk, at least air parity, if not air superiority. Look what they did in Kursk. They gained 40 kilometers into Russia. That's what they can do when they've got what they need to do the job. Attention, Washington. Chuck's online too. Pick it up. I'll tell you how to win this war.
It's amazing to me is that it's so clear to everybody that Ukrainians have all the capacity to win. But unfortunately, some people say, let's tie both hands behind their back and say, we're with you all the way. What the hell does that mean? Do we want them to win or not? If you want them to win, untie their hands, give them what's necessary to win, and do all you can to support that. But the fact that it's still so controversial, not only allowing them to use long range weapons within Russia, but can NATO jets shoot down Russian missiles headed towards Ukrainian cities from NATO territory? So keep in mind, that does not mean that there's going to be any NATO jets over Ukrainian territory. But from the territory, let's say Poland, why should they not be able to shoot down a missile from Russia destined towards a children's hospital in Kyiv? What would the logic be for that? Like, what military logic is there that somehow that makes things better? Because I cannot think of one.
Well, there's also precedent, right? During the latest Iranian tantrum, where they fired hundreds of missiles at Israel, the same thing happened. You know, it's interesting to me. I was talking about this last night on Bullet Points. There is this twisted symbiosis between the press corps in Washington and especially the national security apparatus. The press is no longer the crusading journalists of Watergate. They're poodles, and they get little doggy biscuit nuggets of information if they play ball with the sources. I would love if there is a courageous journalist out there at the next Jake Sullivan meeting, put his hand up and say, or her hand up and say, could you please explain to me what the strategy is in prolonging this war? What are the ramifications? What are the benefits? Because you've embarked on a course of action. You must foresee some benefits. What are the benefits of prolonging this war in Ukraine? Tell me how that makes the security of Europe sounder. Why should we all sleep better at night because Ukraine has to absorb more missile strikes? They can't take the war with the weapons we give them. They can't fight the war the way we all know they should. There is no answer to that, Jason. There isn't. I just want to get to the root cause. Say it out loud so we all know.
Ultimately, I think it does boil down to egos. There's people in the National Security Council who have made a policy years ago, 3 years ago, that we cannot do anything against Russia because it might lead to World War III or nuclear holocaust or whatever the theory they floated. Now it's been proven false. So in order to maintain some credibility in the whatever is left of their credibility, they continue to defend policies that are absurd, that are detrimental to Ukraine, but also detrimental to the United States ultimately. It only gives strength to Russia. Russia now thinks that it's a serious partner. And we have to completely change that paradigm. Russia is not a serious partner. That is, to paraphrase John McCain, truly a gas station run by the mafia. And it should not be treated the same. I think there's a huge part of Western politics that makes an error about this.
Are Russia energy production facilities, are those legit military targets? And you're right. Russia's still making almost $1 billion a day selling energy with the connivance of certain NATO members. I mean, at least a third of the transshipment of this oil occurs in the waters of the Aegean, right under the noses of Greece. India, a nominal ally of the United States as well. The sanctions are being flouted, not only in the letter of the law, but certainly in the spirit of the law. And it's those billions, they fuel the Russian war machine. And by the way, after Ukraine, what's next? We all see what would happen to Ukraine if it's defeated. Let's just say Russia succeeds in biting off Donetsk and Luhansk and hangs on to Crimea. Well, Russia would have paid too much for that, but it would have worked. How is that going to dissuade them to take another piece out of Georgia or Moldova. Just name it. Where? How is that going to deter them? And Mr. Sullivan, what good in that? What good's there for the United States?
We are willing to walk away from our principles in order to satisfy the principles of a dictator in Moscow. It's really has to do that we change the narrative here. Russia should be put on notice that it has decided to do what we said was a red line. We said, do not invade Ukraine. President Biden gave multiple live television briefings explaining that if Russia were to invade, there'd be consequences. So why don't we change this now? Why should a dictatorship engaged in terrorism dictate to the U.S. what the red lines are? The U.S. should dictate to the terrorists and the dictators what our red lines are. And if they don't obey by it, they have to pay the consequences. And it is sick that Ukraine is suffering from Washington's indecision.
And if it is escalation that the National Security Council fears, what does that escalation look like? Does it mean Russia will hit more hospitals? Is that what it looks like? Will they target more chemotherapy centers? What is the escalation look like? And let's just sweep aside the nuclear boogeyman article. That's murder suicide. They're not going to do it. The other thing is, what strategic targets are they going to hit in Ukraine? Is he going to hit Kyiv and kill 3 million people? If he thinks he has problems now, we can just push that aside. That is bluster. It's distraction. It's also pretty pathetic, right? A superpower invaded a weak and divided neighbor, and now they're saying, well, we're going to go nuclear. Why? Because you're getting your butt kicked? Things are not obviously going optimally. And I am still, Jason, I am firmly convinced and committed, and I want to tell the world, as General Hodges does, Russia can't win this war. They're not going to win it. But two entities can't lose it. Ukraine cannot lose it. This is an existential threat to Ukraine. The other thing that is existentially threatened by this war is Vladimir Putin. He started it, his good idea, his 72-hour lightning victory, and it's all of it at his doorstep, and he's got serious problems, right? You and I covered the mutiny, Prigozhin's mutiny live. We wrote that article together. Wagner's gift. It forced Putin to marry the two biggest dunces that he has, Gerasimov and Shoigu. He's welded to the two clowns that delivered this debacle to him.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's Russia can't win. But how long it takes for them to lose, man, that's up to Washington.
Well, that's why ultimately we need to do everything we can, I think, to call our congressmen and senators to put pressure on the White House to make sure that we are letting Ukraine strike back. We are letting Ukraine do what's necessary to defend itself and its people, its civilian population, from Russian missile attacks, which are now on a daily basis. And there's only one way that can happen, which is when the White House decides to let it happen. That's the only time it will happen. So it's time that we really support Ukraine and help Ukraine, not just to defend itself, but to win.
Totally agree.
Well, Chuck, it seems that we well enough agree. The red lines that Washington imposes are costing Ukrainian lives and only helping to protect the Putin regime. I appreciate your time today. Thank you. And thank you for your service.